I'm Enchantress of Numbers, and this is my submission video for Awesome Games Done Quick 2018 with Biomiracle Bokutte Upa, any % normal difficulty. So getting started here, you'll see that this is a side-scrolling platformer. You control a baby named Upa. We just got a heart power-up that extends your life meter. And right here is a bell power-up that lets you run and makes you invincible, so we can run straight through all of the enemies for a limited amount of time. And that power-up only shows up 2 times in the game, so we have to make as much use of it as we can when we get it. As you're seeing, the rattle lets you inflate enemies, and then you can either ride on them, as we've been doing to get a little bit of a speed burst, or you can hit those enemies and send them flying, and that's the way that you have to take care of these bosses like that. So the boss of the first world is this pig that spits out enemies that you have to shoot back at him. And we'll be seeing a lot of this pig throughout the game. And going into World 1-2, this introduces a slightly different stage mechanic where it's compared a lot to Dig Dug, but basically you're just eating your way through a giant cake, and there are these mole enemies, and this is one of the highest reset points for RTA attempts, because the way those moles move is whenever they can, they want to turn either left or right, but it's random which direction they go, so they'll take a step and then try to turn, and then take a step and try to turn. So if they're in a very small confined space, their movement is predictable, but in larger gaps, their movement is rather unpredictable, and so it leads to a lot of resets. Thankfully, the stage is pretty short, and we're through that. And at the end of each stage, there's a chest that you have to open up with your rattle, and it contains fairies that will fly you off to the next stage. So we're back in a regular platforming stage, and that's a very tight jump that I just missed. It saves maybe 2 seconds if you can make that jump. And then those popsicles, the double red popsicles, are actually sticky, and you will see their mechanic here coming up where you have to jump 3 times to get off of them. Or that time we actually fell off of it rather than having to jump the 3rd time. But as I briefly mentioned before, we keep hitting these enemies and walking on top of them because the game takes the speed of the enemy and adds your walking speed to them, so it gives you a slight speed burst and makes things go just a little bit faster if you can ride on top of an enemy anytime you can. So here's a cool thing: you can buffer a hit on this boss there during his spawn animation, which saves maybe a second. And so a lot of the times these boss fights rely on being able to stand in places where the game doesn't want you to. And in the instance where you have 2 chests like this, at the end of each world has 3 stages, and in the 3rd stage there's typically 2 chests that you can choose from. It's random, but one of them will have a 1-up and one of them will have the fairies, and so you always want to find the ones with the fairies in them. Stage 2.1 here, this one is one of the more planned out stages as far as how everything works and which enemies we hit are planned out. That was an important small jump there to manipulate the spawn of that enemy. These blue sine wave flying enemies basically will spawn at the height of your character, based on the height of your character, so a little jump like that forces it to spawn a little bit higher, and you don't have to wait for him to ride up to get onto there. I paused the game right there very briefly to manipulate the internal timer because you saw that platform was disappearing and reappearing. If I hadn't paused it, I would have fallen straight through to my death, so. And here we're seeing another instance of doing these double hits where we don't have to wait for after each hit for a new enemy to be spit out by the boss, and those double hits typically save around a half a second each time you can do one of those. We're in our very first swimming stage, and unfortunately this one is a vertical swimming stage, which means that it is basically a minute of pure mashing, and so there's not a ton of interesting stuff to say about this one. This stage could be a good point for some donations. But basically it's the same mechanics, you're just swimming throughout the stage, and one interesting point is that we'll see is the screen actually wraps left to right when it's a vertical scrolling stage like this. So, and also it's worth noting that each of the worlds has a specific theme. So World 1 was dessert themed, World 2 here is kind of vegetable themed, World 3 is ice themed, World 4 is like circuit board themed, World 5 is like school or office supplies, World 6 is dairy themed, and World 7 is like a Lego themed basically. So now we're into World 2-3, and this one has some interesting tight platforming coming up on it. We have these moving platforms, which are nice to get a little bit of a speed burst from. And coming up here is the balloon jump, which is a pretty tight jump. You're supposed to wait and go on a third balloon that comes up in the middle, but that basically costs you an extra cycle. And so we don't want to take that risk, or lose that time, rather. So it's better to take the risk of missing the jump. But it's a tight jump, but it's easy to get pretty consistent if you practice it. So we're going to see a new boss finally. This is a snake boss, and we get to hit these frogs into him. So the frogs just keep streaming in from the right side of the screen. And unfortunately I hit him there during the enemy's iframes and didn't help, so. One other thing to notice is, so we have 3 hearts right now, but as we go into World 3-1, we'll be back at 2 hearts. So the hearts that you collect, you lose them all every time you go into a new world. And we're skipping a lot of hearts in this run because, for the most part, the hearts are out of your way. Occasionally we do need them for damage boosting, but for the most part, unless the heart's right on our path, we don't get it. So, and there was a damage boost across those spikes. So, and the ice is a bit slippery. The platforming in this game is really tight, but the ice does present some challenges, I think. The game was released for the Famicom Disk System originally in 1988, and then in 1993 it was released for the Famicom as a cartridge as well. So I think at that time, I mean, it was almost like a requirement from Nintendo that you had to have an ice world in your game. It seems like. So there we have another pig fight. So this one's kind of like ice but in a cave. It's dark, although we have the stars in the background, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. But this is, again, we're just trying to take advantage of the enemies being able to walk across them however we can. To get a little bit of a speed boost, we have to pause slightly here because otherwise we'll miss the jump onto that vertical platform. So, and this game was also, it did see a North America release in in 2008 on the Wii Virtual Console, but otherwise it was a Japan exclusive. There's a nice double hit on that pig boss. So if you haven't been following along and you don't know the story, basically you're playing as Upa. The game's name, Biomiracle Bokutte Upa, translates to Biomiracle I am Upa, and You are the latest in the line of brave fighters, and you're a prince in this magical kingdom. And so, prior to the game starting, Upa broke an urn that contained the spirit of an evil goat demon. And so that evil goat demon kidnapped all the babies in the kingdom and was taking the life force of the adults in the kingdom. So Upa is the only person in the kingdom who can save the day. And so we're going after this goat armed with our magic rattle. And so here we have a new boss, a walrus with a top hat. And when he does this slide animation, he is invincible. So the goal for this fight is you want to get a one cycle where he only does that slide animation once. And we can do this by manipulating the direction that these enemies walk, because they always try to walk towards you whenever they fall. And every 50,000 points you get a 1-up, so I believe we just got a 1-up there. Now this stage is really interesting because it is very similar in a lot of ways to the castle mazes from Super Mario Bros. 1, where like in 4-4 of Super Mario 1 you have to take the specific path through the castle or it will loop on you, and this is the same way. So it may look like I could find a slightly faster path or ride across more enemies if I were to take a different path. Basically, the path that I'm taking is the path that you need to take. There are some interesting things. There are a couple of holes you see in the ceiling, and those will take you to sort of bonus rooms that have some power-ups in them. But they do cost time, so we just don't bother even trying to go for them in the speedrun. And really, we don't need the power-ups. This is a pretty straightforward stage. We have a nice open area here for this boss fight, so we can get a nice double hit in to save some time. So, and as you probably already noticed, this baby has ups. He can really jump. So now, everyone's favorite mechanic, upside down play. So, this doesn't add that much of a challenge to the game. It is a little disorienting at first, but once you play the game enough, it's really not so bad. This is another stage where the strategy is pretty well mapped out to try to minimize the amount of time you have to wait on enemies to get up to a higher platform, or I guess in this case a lower platform. And so it's also, we're in 4-2, there's a heart up above there, or maybe that's a health refill, I can't remember. But anyway, we damage boosted across the spikes with 2 health, so we can't take any damage on the boss. And with this, it's a little awkward to do a double hit on that platform, so we just, the general strat is to just do the kind of a stun lock fight on him instead. And then World 4-3 follows up with kind of changing up the mechanics of the game, because here we fight the boss first. And so we've got another snake fight. This snake will breathe like a long, shot of fire at you if you let him, but if you keep sending enemies his way, he often will not get a chance to get a shot off at you. So that little sand timer, or hourglass power-up basically stops the enemy movement and the in-game timer for I'm not exactly sure how many seconds, like 5 or 10 seconds. Probably 5 seconds. But it's a pretty short stage, and you notice that the in-game timer is actually really short for that stage as well. And it's also interesting that that's the only World 3 stage that doesn't give you 2 chests to... or World X-3 stage that doesn't give you 2 chests to work on. So this stage is has a lot, or this world actually has a lot of moving platforms, which adds for some neat speed tech. So kind of made a mistake there, and the damage boosts always boost you to the left. And what I forgot to do, or what I failed to do, was turn around just before landing on those pencils, which act like spikes, to get a damage boost in the proper direction. So we'll get it this time. So we get the damage boost. And also don't forget to stock up on blue. Those jars you think would be glue, but they say blue with a B. So there's a lot of tight platforming going on in this stage, and it's kind of hard to explain all of it as it's happening, but basically there's a lot of times where you could easily miss a jump and fall into a pit. So this fight is kind of interesting because the conveyor belt adds a little extra mechanic to the game, and with the conveyor belt overhead, it's really difficult to do a double hit, so the strat is just to do that sort of stun lock pattern that we just did. Okay. So 5-2 has a lot of these chalk bags, or I'm not even sure what they're supposed to be, but they fall from overhead, and if they land on you, they hurt you. But they're just all over the stage, and I'm not even sure what they're supposed to be. So if you stay on the high road here, that box does have a heart upgrade in it, but it's a little bit slower, I think, and it's a very tight jump to get it. So I've recently started routing that jump out just because I think it saves a little bit of time to skip it. So here you have a very narrow platform with the pig on it, and it's you're not supposed to be able to stay up on here, but we've found ways to manipulate it to be able to do that. If you don't, like in a more casual fight, if you fight him from the moving platforms below, it's a much more difficult fight that takes way longer. So World 5-3 here has it's the second and final swimming stage. This time it's horizontal, so it's not nearly as mash heavy, which is good. But it will also feature an underwater boss fight, which is the only underwater boss fight of the game. So in the middle section, the second box does have a heart upgrade, but if you go any route other than the bottom, the current slows you down, and so unless you really need the heart upgrade, it's not worth it to go anywhere except for the bottom route there. And then the top route here, actually the current speeds you up, which is really helpful. So, and then this little hallway with the pencils on the top and bottom is very tricky to make it through without taking damage. And quite frequently I'll take 2 damage going through there. So this fight is really interesting, a recently discovered strat. You can do these double hits on this boss, and if you have to hit him 5 times. If you can get 2 double hits in, like I do here, it saves between 9 and 10 in-game seconds. So it saves quite a bit of time because the seahorse will go through a long swimming animation after a hit if you don't get the double hit in. So the double hit basically cancels that swimming animation, which lets you fight him a lot faster. So this cake, or cheese at the bottom here, I missed the hit on that enemy, but if you land in the cheese there, you will fall into it. You can jump off of it, but you'll sink into it, and so it's kind of like a quicksand mechanic. and the physics of it are a little weird. It's hard to turn around and stuff in it, so it's best to avoid it whenever you can. So here's the second and final use of the bell power-up. And then we've got some interesting platforming coming up where you actually have to wait for enemies to ride across. And so here I'm manipulating their spawns to be able to go through without having to wait for them. So the old strat, you'd have to, like, you'd get stunned from falling too far, and you'd have to be constantly waiting on the enemies to come to you, so it's really difficult. Or it's a big improvement. And the goal here, we had to do that to be able to get up on top of this platform to take out this boss a lot faster, so yeah, that's another boss fight. You're not really supposed to be able to be up there by the boss, but if you find a way to get up there, and it makes it a lot easier. So here's our second Dig Dug stage, and this is a very nice stage, and you'll see why. So we just took some damage, and then we're going to damage boost across these spikes. These green mice basically try to follow you wherever they can, so it's kind of interesting. They just always walk towards you. The pink mice are more like the moles from the first stage like this. And as you can see, it's a very nice stage. So this next stage is, I think, quite probably the worst stage in the game, without much comparison. The mashing of the vertical swimming stage is really the only contender for which one could be worse. But basically we've got these birds that fly in kind of like Cheep Cheeps, and their spawns adjust based on your vertical height, so which is both good and bad. But there we got a little stun, and then we get onto here. So, and now these birds are just flying at you left and right, and if you have to hit them or you're going to take damage like that. So a little neat manipulation to take out one of those birds. And then falling platform, the falling platforms aren't really marked out for you, so you just have to know where they are, which is it's a little frustrating for a new player, but for a speedrun you'd have that memorized anyway. So these like bouncy jellies platforms here are really what makes this stage so bad, because it's really difficult to keep your eye on the boss and then also on your positioning with them to know when you can get a good jump, because when you press the jump, based on how far down you've depressed the gelatin, determines the height of the jump that you can get. But now we have the pig boss, and he's flying and he's shooting lightning bolts at you. He's got a big upgrade here, and all of that combined with the bouncy platform that you've got to work with just makes that a very difficult fight to optimize. So that's probably the worst fight in the game. Okay, so I forgot to hold left at the start of this stage here. This is another vertical stage, but it's a blind fall. So playing this stage blind or in a casual playthrough is very frustrating, because as you can see, there are these spikes that are going to do damage on you if you land on them, and you don't have a lot of time to react when they show up on screen, so you just kind of have to know where they are. But at least it's not a very long stage. At the start of the stage there was a little power-up for an extra heart container, but it costs like 3 seconds to get it, and so it's definitely not worth taking the time to go get that. It's also, I don't remember if I mentioned that this is a Konami game, But some people also liken or say that the boss fight music reminds them a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1 boss fight music. So, but here we see some introductions of new. So there I landed too close to the end of the platform and my jump input was eaten. So we get to start it over again. But we see some new enemies, these porcupine-type enemies that will shoot spikes at you, or whatever those are, and then these star enemies that sort of jump around, and your magic rattle doesn't work on either the spikes or the stars. So we did get a heart power-up, which is good, and then coming up here we'll see these flying elephants enemies as well, and oh, we start to see some goat portraits on the wall. That's a little foreshadowing for the evil goat demon who's the main antagonist of the game. So but everyone who watches this stage likes to, or notices pretty much, that they definitely are ripping off of the Lego building block aesthetic with the way that they designed the stage. So here, this is a fun stage. We get some damage boosts on these spikes. And so that helps us not lose time to going on the reverse scrolling platform or conveyor platform above that at the beginning. And then here we've got these gumdrops that we're jumping over. And we're going to take a damage boost on this. We damage boosted the proper direction, which is good. And I forgot to mention everyone's favorite part of this stage. Early on there was a vertical stack of blocks that says Beeb, and that's where I got the name for this stage in my splits as well. So we just got a 1-up. Also on this stage is a second 1-up and a heart upgrade if you want to get it. But that's a very tight jump there. You basically just can't stop, and you do a full jump and you land on the enemy. Here we're going to manipulate this enemy's spawn so that we basically limit how long we have to wait on him. Take an intentional damage boost through that enemy. And now we're on a vertical climbing section for a boss fight, and this is the penultimate boss, another one of these snakes, and we get these blue enemies just falling down from the ceiling endlessly. And this is a pretty easy boss fight, and I basically damage boost through that last one. And now here we're fighting the goat. You have to hit him 7 times, I believe. And so it's... he follows a predictable pattern, and so as long as the little goat enemies that you have to hit him with cooperate, he's not too difficult, but they like to get themselves trapped in the corner, which is frustrating. But there we go, we got our 7 hits in, and time happens when the screen goes to black here. So we have just rescued all of the babies, and so there's time, and that's with 2 deaths. That was less than 30 seconds off of my world record run, which was a deathless run. So as far as this run is concerned, the goal for the community is to get this down into the 27-minute range, and world record is 4 seconds off of that, and so there's a really good chance that the world record will be in the 27-minute category, or in the 27-minute range by the end of it. So, and now we've rescued the kingdom, and everyone has started to enjoy living there again, and now Upa can sleep on some candy while the credits roll. So, once again, I am Enchantress of Numbers, and this was my Awesome Games Done Quick 2018 submission video for Biomiracle Bokutte Upa, category of any % normal difficulty. Thanks for watching.